Hi Year 10 and welcome to your extension task for your essay redraft improvements. This should be a much shorter video, but it's much kind of high level ideas that I just wanted you to try and put in if you have the time, thinking about genre and tragedy, which will help with our AO3 marks. So I wonder if we could say something about tragic structure and how Shakespeare uses this in Macbeth to interest the audience. So this is a very famous model of a structure of a tragedy, and this is often referred to as Freytag's pyramid, for example. Act 1, as you can see, is this kind of first column, and it begins with a prologue and it introduces characters and settings. And down the bottom you can see a kind of posh word for this section of the play that might be useful to get into your essays, which is protasis. Okay, so this is where everything is set up. If you have a look at the kind of shape of this graph as well, it's kind of insinuating that the drama level here is quite low as well. So you can really interrogate how far the opening of Macbeth does what Act 1 traditionally is meant to do. So does it introduce characters and setting? A lot of you have already discussed this. Does it keep the drama level low, or is it actually quite a kind of high intensity, almost kind of action-packed starter where we're already quite stressed? So starting with the witches, for example, how dramatic is that? How tense do we feel for Macbeth? Obviously the kind of tension and the rise of Macbeth as well, and if we think of this line not only in terms of tension but in terms of the hero's kind of journey, he's going to ascend socially, isn't he? So he is awarded the Thane of Cawdor, he's going to become king, so he's going to have that social ascension as well, all the way to the climax, the turning point after which the downfall is inevitable. So this opening, if you think about this graph, is all about introducing Macbeth in a way that makes the rest of this trajectory, I suppose, inevitable. It makes the rest of the trajectory clear to the audience or understandable in some way. So when we think about how Macbeth is introduced, we think about how he has this really violent, bloodthirsty side, but also this kind of noble, loyal, brave side as well. We think about how he is at once a kind of leader on the battlefield, and yet is also imbued with a sense of duty to his king, to his country, and also has this kind of partnership with his wife that was quite kind of out of the ordinary when you think of gender dynamics in the Jacobean period, where they're quite a partnership and they work together. And some people kind of interpret Lady Macbeth as having power over her husband. So in some ways he's a leader, and yet in other ways he's somebody who's kind of easily led or misled, you might say, by people like his wife and indeed the witches. So in terms of introducing the setting and introducing the character, we're thinking about how does the beginning really set up this absolute rise to, the height of society from which a tragic hero has to fall, but also how does it set up the kind of coming tensions and dramas and this idea that Macbeth's going to make some decisions that are going to kind of link to his downfall later on. Another way of thinking about this then in a more kind of detailed and typically Shakespearean way might be to use this graph. So if we have a look at the first kind of few moments along this trajectory, we have the exposition at stage 1. Okay, we learnt the word exposition when we were doing the well-made play with an Inspector Calls. So exposition is just kind of setting up the story, isn't it? It's giving us the background information that we need to know. So let's have a little read of exposition. Since Shakespeare's stage had no central curtain and few stage props, the exposition reveals the setting, time and place, and sometimes highlights the theme. It has the important function of providing the appropriate mood and atmosphere for the play, and also acting as a hook to engage the audience. Shakespeare rarely introduces his tragic figure at this stage. So many of you have explained that so brilliantly. What's interesting and what might be worth unpacking a little is that this is typical of Shakespeare to delay the introduction of the tragic hero and think about why he would do that and what that might imply about Macbeth. Lots of you were talking about this idea that, in the Globe you have to kind of grab everybody's attention because it's almost like a kind of football match, just standing there in broad daylight. There's no kind of lights coming down or anything like that to draw people's attention. So he starts with the witches and he starts with something kind of scary. A lot of us were brilliant at talking about mood and atmosphere and how he uses pathetic fallacy. You could afford, I think, to stretch those into further uses of pathetic fallacy later in the play. What mood is created in the first act, and how does that link to what comes next? Yeah, so think about this introduction of the witches and think about later uses of the witches, just to push on your ideas about this idea of a tragedy having a really thoughtful opening that sets up the rest of the drama. The next thing, so stage 2 here, the second point, is called the inciting force. So that's when an incident introduces conflict and sets in motion the rising action of the play. So have a little think about Macbeth. What is it that sets him on that journey to not only social ascension, but to a big rise before a big fall? What is it that makes him think that he could, I suppose, take charge of his own life? And for me, that would probably be when the prophecy seems to be coming true. Okay? I would argue that probably when he's met the witches, he's not going to have the courage to follow through anything, to really believe in them as these kind of supernatural outcasts. But as soon as they start to prove correct, he entertains the idea, doesn't he? So I would say our inciting force is when he's made Thane of Cawdor. So you could also talk about that and use that term, inciting force, and how that sets up the rest of the drama, and how that sets him on a different trajectory to if something hadn't happened. This next bit is something that kind of becomes, I suppose, more apparent as the play goes on. So Hamartia is an error of judgment on behalf of the tragic hero. So he has some kind of fatal flaw, as we all know. In our play, lots of people agree that Macbeth's fatal flaw is ambition. And as a result of that fatal flaw, he makes an error of judgment that later brings him down. Okay, it leads to the catastrophe of the play. The catastrophe, if you look back at this, is Act 4 and Act 5 when he's on that downfall spectrum. So catastrophe, if you have a look here, is this kind of final section. So he needs to make an error of judgment here. Okay, so while it's saying at this point, so on this kind of half of the triangle, if you will, the protagonist still seems in control of his or her fate. That idea of control of a fate is something that increasingly slips in a tragedy, isn't it? It's kind of snowballs, and all of a sudden there's nothing they can do, and they're kind of doomed, and everybody's going to die. At this point, there is still kind of room to turn back almost. So you could debate that as well in the opening. With this idea of the tragic flaw and making an error of judgment, you might say that his error of judgment is trusting the witches. You might say that his error of judgment is deciding to kill Duncan. You might say that actually his error of judgment comes after Act 1 in killing Duncan. So you need to decide where you think that hamartia arises, or where the kind of key moment of hamartia is. But also think about how is it being foreshadowed in things like the exposition and the inciting force. So when he hears that he's been made Thane of Cawdor, he has that aside, doesn't he? What does he say in that aside to the audience that we can hear that nobody else can? Can we see little flashes of this ambition that we know is going to bring him down later in the play? So just because the hamartia, the error of judgment that you think is the kind of turning point setting him up for this big fall, might not have happened yet, there will be flashes of it earlier on. So you could even talk about his prowess on the battlefield, for example. The bloodthirstiness that we see in Act 1, Scene 2 is a foreshadowing that he's going to be equally bloodthirsty, or really not care about murdering somebody up close and personal, because he does it all day, every day, and he's been kind of desensitized to it. It's a little bit like when we spoke about Remains, Simon Armitage's poem, and how in the moment as a soldier it doesn't really seem that significant to you, and then later on you suffer post-traumatic stress disorder, and how that can kind of desensitize you and set you on a path that maybe makes you feel, I don't know, less human, less emotionally engaged, kind of removed from what you do. So those are the kind of 3 elements, if you will, that you could have scope to discuss in your Act 1 essay if you're thinking about tragedy. Okay, so have a little think about those ideas. Can you get them into your redraft? How does Act 1 function as a typical tragic scene? But if you're feeling particularly clever, is there anything that Shakespeare does in Act 1 of Macbeth that's maybe atypical, that maybe like pushes the bounds of tragedy?